My name's Harry Katz. I am Dean and Professor at the ILR School at Cornell University, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this session. This session is titled The Improvement of Skill Mismatches, Linkage Between Education and Employment. We have two distinguished presenters and two discussants. And I'll move on to introduce them in turn so we can maximize the time that's available for questions. The first speaker is Professor Jinhan Bai. He is a professor in the Department of Economics from Cheongnam National University. And he's also the president of the Korean Labor Economic Association and head of the Research Institute for Small and Medium Enterprise Policies. Professor Bai. What's the time limit? Time limit is 15 minutes. They're going to hold the sign.
Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you. I'm very glad to have opportunity to present my paper in this Global HR Forum. The title of my paper is Towards Improving Supply-Demand Mismatch in Skill from School to Work. I think nowadays our country experiences very severe challenges in human resource area. Purpose of my paper is to review some important issues such as mismatch between education and jobs for young people and the supply-demand mismatches of labor force. And I will suggest some necessary measures to reinforce the linkage between education and employment with special reference to Daedeok Innopolis in my hometown, Daejeon. Nowadays, efforts for HRD is much more necessary in our country than ever. In addition, pressing demand of national economy on HRD, firstly, development of man-made brain power industries. Brain power industries mean information, telecommunication, bioengineering, computer software and hardware, so-called knowledge-based economy. Secondly, changes of the environment in establishment, growth, and HRD of enterprises. Thirdly, reductions in manufacturing industries and the development of service industries. Fourthly, the economic concentration toward the metropolitan area and the shrinking of region's economy. Brain drain is one of the serious problems in local economy. They cannot high quality manpower easily, cannot get high quality manpower easily. Fifthly, youth unemployment increase. And I'm very afraid if we cannot prepare some effective measures, our country may experience so-called strategy tsunami in skilled labor force in the near future, about 10 years or 15 years within Sixthly, continuing supply-demand mismatch in labor market. As a second change, changes of environment in establishment, growth, and HRD enterprises. I will focus on labor input. 2000, high schooling and high wages in young people, proficient in IT cultural environment, shortage of skilled manpower, and pursuing equalized HRD, maybe all people will become university graduates in the near future in our country. For example, all taxi drivers may be university graduates in the near future also. And reducing education and the training of workers and hiring experienced workers in the companies. And deepening the dual structure of industrial relations. Unions are organized and have a strong bargaining power in large companies, but not in small companies. As a third change, annual growth rate of GDP and the annual growth rate of investment, average annual job increases go down in Korea. As you see, jobs of manufacturing go down very fast, but jobs of services go up and goes up. So manufacturing industry is shrinking and the service industry is expanding in Korea. As a fourth change, trend of economic concentration toward the metropolitan area cannot be overlooked. In this table, the term the metropolitan area means the sum of Seoul, Incheon, and Gyeonggi-do province. As you can see, employee ratio jumps over 50% firstly in 2007. As a fifth change or factor, unemployment rate of young people is maintaining higher level after the foreign exchange crisis of Korea about 1998. As you, sorry. Age composition of employment in manufacturing industry is becoming old and old. The peak point of this distribution, peak point of this distribution moves to the right and the right. The distance between the peak point of 1991 and the peak point of 2008 is nearly the same as time passes between 1991 and 2008. After 10 or 15 years, many old workers may be retired. So I call this phenomenon as a tsunami of skilled workers. I will skip some pictures. As a sixth factor, you can see shortage rate of labor force by industry in 2008 of Korea. In this table, this column is This period is under global financial crisis, so shortage rate become lower. But shortage rate is higher in some industry. And in the same period, the job offer rate also became lower drastically recently. Average curve of our country from 2000 to 2009. In this figure, vertical axis measures vacancy rate. Horizontal axis measures unemployment rate. Vacancy rate goes up too in our country. And you can see the recent trend of new students and the graduates of junior college and university. Unemployment rate in this figure. The third curve, this curve, shows unemployment rate of young people. And this curve shows unemployment rate of older people whose age is 30 years and over. Based on this figure, we can expect unemployment rate of young people will not go up further in the near future because the difference will be maintained in the near future. This figure shows employment rate mismatched and graduate increase from 2004 to 2008 in junior college. And this figure shows employment rate mismatched ratio, graduate increase from same period in university. I have no idea about why graduates of social science have increased for 4 years, even though its employment rate and mismatched ratio is much lower than other fields. This curve is graduate change for 4 years. This bar, employment rate, this blue bar, mismatched ratio. Humanity and the social science field, employment rate and mismatched rate lower than other fields. You can see. But in our country, our public employment service system to aid the job seekers to find proper jobs with job information and the job matching services is very weak yet. As you can see, the number of steps of PES in Korea, 2,000, about 3,000. But other countries, very high. And the economically active population per step is fourfold of that of USA and even Japan, 2.2-fold, as you can see. If then, what should we do? I studied this issue with special reference to our city, Daejeon, especially to the famous science complex, the Innopolis. You can see outlined the Innopolis. It designated as a special area by the special law, and Innopolis means a kind of compound word, innovation plus policy, a city. And 2007, 861 resident institutes, and 10% of domestic R&D manpower, and 30% of government R&D fund are concentrated in this Innopolis. This Innopolis located in Daejeon City. Area map is like this. This employment condition and problems that the Innopolis resident in the number of resident institutes in the Innopolis like this. Manpower status of the Innopolis like this. I will skip this paper, this page. In my study, I asked some questions. Some questions about most effective recruiting route by company type. In this Innopolis, companies are mainly composed of small and venture companies. This new company means the age of company is less than 5 years. The senior company means the age of this company is 5 years and over. They recruited workers by step recommendation mainly. In case of cost-listed, they have relied heavily upon step recommendation and school recommendation. You can see difficulties against recruiting skilled workers by company type in this table. In case of negative impression on small and regional company, 87.5% new company type, and 84.6% in senior type of company. Most young people and university graduates do not like local small company, as you can see in this table. In this table, you can see difference between student expectation and reality in many companies. As one important factor, there is a big difference between annual salary paid by companies and expected annual salary students. In company can pay mostly 20 million won in annual salary, from 20 million won to 25 million. But expected annual salary of students higher than by 5 million won annually. The difference between two classes is about 5 million. So I've got some problems in supply-demand mismatch of data inner policy. In case of supply side, firstly, local small venture companies are not very attractive to young university graduates. Secondly, access to information on promising companies is not easy. Thirdly, industrial field-oriented education should be emphasized. In many cases, they are somewhat independent. Education is education. Industrial field is industrial field. In many cases, they are some independent of each other. Fourthly, job search orientation and service should be started step by step from sophomore or junior level in college and university. Demand side, in case of demand side, first, the fact that efforts for HRD improve the business performance of small venture companies should be recognized. In fact, many CEOs do not know the importance of HRD. Secondly, real-time job information systems should be strengthened. Thirdly, tailored recruiting fair by industry, occupation, and type of job seeker can reduce skill mismatches significantly. Measures to improve mismatches should be specified or specialized, respectively, by industry and company type. I will skip this page. So a final suggestion of my paper is several points. Firstly, regional governance system for employment and HRD is needed strongly. Secondly, CEO lectures and mentoring service for university students is necessary. And thirdly, providing public relation opportunities for companies can make students get information about them. Fourthly, tailored recruiting fair by industry and occupation in a policy is needed. Improve the operation of intern programs. And operating employment reserve student specified in a policy is needed. And activating real-time job nets. And programs upgrading job competence based on demand-oriented consortia. And improving business environment for HRD. For example, high-quality education service, high-quality medical service, shopping service, and so on, because these measures can make high-quality manpower settled down in a policy easily. I have not so many time. Thank you.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce the second presenter for this session. Francesco Pastore is Assistant Professor of Economics at the Seconda Università di Napoli in Italy. He's also a Research Fellow of IZA Bonn. Professor Pastore.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and to give my talk to a distinguished audience like this. It's nice to say that my co-author is also the president of the Italian Association of Labor Economists. And I'm going to speak about a problem that, as my previous seminar was explaining, is one of the big problems in Italy, which is youth unemployment. The aim of the presentation is to give a frame of mind to understand the youth unemployment problem, its causes and consequences. So I will not give you many data, many statistical data, but in fact, previous presentation was full of information about this, and therefore these two presentations can be easily complementary to each other. Also, I will try to provide with my presentation and my paper some criteria to assess the ex-ante effectiveness of youth employment policy and to understand the evolution of the debate on this issue. The key word of my presentation, as you have seen from title, is the youth experience gap, which is I argue, the main difference between young people and adults in an era when young people are experiencing increasing education. They still experience in every part of the world, including Korea, as we have seen, a gap with respect to adults in terms of employment opportunities. We can define an absolute disadvantage of young people in terms of their unemployment rate. But we can also define a relative disadvantage, which is measured by the ratio of the youth to the adult unemployment rate. From the presentation of the previous speaker, I could notice that in the case of Korea, it is about 3.5 or even about 4. And I would say that it is very, very high. So also in Korea, I think that this issue of youth unemployment will be very important. Also now, perhaps, in terms of relative disadvantage. In fact, I will suggest that there are two different views about the ways to reduce youth unemployment. One is the liberalist view, and the other one is the interventionist view. I mean, this is perhaps a traditional standard way of looking at these problems. We should not take it too seriously because, of course, everybody is at the meantime liberalist and interventionist, but it's a way to classify ideas, I think, and it's always very useful. And I will also provide the ILO school to work transition classification, and I will argue that when we think of the youth unemployment problem, we should consider the entire system of school to work transitions, whereas labor market is only one part of the system. And the educational system, the educational sector is not less important. And I will show that the unemployment rate of young people is very much related not only to the degree of labor market flexibility, but also to the degree of effectiveness of the educational system in providing high quality education and guidance for young people in the labor market. I will start from a seminal paper by Clark and Summers, 82. It was for the first time looking at comparing the transitions in the labor market between employment, unemployment, and inactivity of young people and adults. And what he noticed is that, in fact, young people have a very high rate of labor mobility. The young people, they move in and out of employment, unemployment, and training. They sometimes go back to the educational and training system to get some more education that they think was not, because they think that their education was not enough. I heard the previous speaker saying that having some work experience is important for young people, also to understand what is their best job match. And therefore, that's what happens. Young people go to the labor market when they feel it's time to go, and then they realize that perhaps they need some more education, that they were on the wrong way. They were like aiming to get one job, and then they get another one, they want to get another one. They understand that it's not their destiny to work in that sector, and they want to study something else. And therefore, they go back to the educational system for that. And the consequence of this is that we observe typically short employment spells and also unemployment spells of young people as compared to adults, but a higher rate of unemployment, and also a tendency of segmentation in the youth labor market between successful young people and low-skilled young people that experience a high degree of precariousness and also social exclusion in many times. And what is the reason why young people have this disadvantage as compared to adults in all countries of the world, except for some of them, as we will see later? Well, the reason is the experience gap, what I call the youth experience gap. I mean, young people are increasingly educated. They have an increasingly level of education, but they lack the other two components of human capital. As we know, human capital is not only education, it is also work experience. General work experience that you can learn in any kind of job, like learning a functional division of labor within a firm, or the hierarchy that you find in a firm, or any other type of experience that you can easily transfer to other jobs, from one job to another. And also you have job-specific work experience, which is something that you can acquire only over a long period of time working in the same kind of job, and that you cannot easily transfer to other types of jobs. And of course, young people, they miss both types of experience, both the generic and the job-specific work experience. How to fill in the youth experience gap? Well, the usual way that young people experience themselves, as Clark and Summers were suggesting, is just to move in and out of employment and education and inactivity. In fact, when we look at the labor market behavior of young people, we typically find that they are, in the meantime, employed in education, or perhaps they are in education, but they are already searching for jobs, or they are inactive, but in the meantime, they have some little job and so on. So it's difficult to classify, even to classify the labor market status of young people as anybody working with data on young people has experienced. This search, as I said before, implies sometimes going back to education, but also experiencing temporary unemployment spells. What is the liberalist approach to the problem of young people? The liberalist approach is simply to ask why to bother about young people problems. I mean, they will find their way. They are young, they need to become adult, and what is the best way to help them? Just give them more flexibility in the labor market so that they can make their experience, they can fill in their experience gap in a quicker way. And this was the OECD suggestion, let's say back in '94, the OECD job study, where the idea was to increase. They observed that also in Europe, for instance, or comparing Europe and the United States, the youth unemployment was much higher, where the labor market was more rigid. So in Europe, and within Europe, in those countries, Mediterranean countries, Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, where the labor market is more rigid. So how to reduce the youth unemployment problem in the south of Europe? By increasing labor market flexibility. That was something that every country in Europe has strongly supported and also implemented in recent years. I mean, since the mid-90s. And in fact, we have seen an increasing share of temporary work in Europe, and also reduction in entry wages for young people, which is a way to, if young people are less productive than adults, we should admit that they should be paid lower wages as compared to adults to be hired by employers, to become attractive to employers. But there are some objections, as we'll see in the next slides, to this point of view. One is that there's a literature asking whether temporary work is actually the right way for young people to find a permanent job. So whether it is a stepping stone from school to work, let's say, or whether it is a dead-end job. I mean, some people experience temporary work and they move from one temporary work job to another without finding a permanent job. And the other objection is that, in fact, temporary work may not be able to supply the type of skills that are within what we have called job-specific work experience. It can help young people to get general work experience, but not necessarily job-specific work experience. And also, based on Heckman and Borges, the idea that increasing mobility is going to reduce long-term unemployment might not be true. And the reason why some people experience negative unemployment duration, I mean, increasing unemployment rate with increasing duration of unemployment, so positive duration dependence in unemployment, will be due to the lack of labor mobility. Whereas in some estimates, it is possible that we are just sketching specific groups that experience long-term unemployment and therefore increasing also unemployment. What is the advantage of labor market flexibility and temporary work? Well, first of all, as I said before, it can provide a stepping stone to permanent work. It's an opportunity for employers to find a buffer stock of workers in expansionary times to be fired in downturns, so to adapt the workforce to the up and down of the business cycle, and also to try young people. But there are also some disadvantages, like some temporary workers enter low-pay traps. They start doing only temporary jobs, and low-paid jobs become permanent in some cases. I mean, only in some cases, but we should also consider these. And also, there might be some problem of training or training trap. I mean, in some cases, young people start doing training courses, and they finish one training course and they start another one, and so on, without finding actually the way to a permanent job. And there is an increasing power of insiders. Literature also shows that if we increase the share of temporary work, the power of those with a permanent job will increase in the labor market. So they will be able to affect the average level of wages and therefore increase, not reduce, the unemployment rate of young people that are the lowest, low-skilled people in the labor market. And also, there is a high cost for households as a consequence of temporary work. I'll just give you this data by Ichino. Ichino tried to estimate, Italian economist, he tried to estimate, is only one of the studies that have been done to measure the impact of temporary work on employment probability of young people. But his paper is very interesting because he does studies with a specific methodology that allows to estimate the so-called causal effect of temporary work on employment probability. And he estimates not only the gross impact of having a temporary work on employment, but also the so-called net impact, controlling for the differences between the unemployed and the temporary workers. He tries to measure the impact of being in temporary work rather than unemployed in finding a permanent job. And what he finds is that this net impact is different in the south and in the north of Italy. So in the south, where we have high youth unemployment, then in the north, we have that the impact is lower of temporary work. So temporary work might also be more effective in countries where the economy is going well, and where perhaps also the labor force is more skilled. And therefore temporary work is more effective when the labor force is more skilled, has a higher level of education. And he finds that net impact of temporary work on the probability to find a job in Tuscany, which is one of the most developed regions in Italy, is higher than in Sicily, which is one of the lowest developed regions in Italy. But also there is a study by Berton, De Vicenti, and Pacelli that find that there is also a temporary work trap. I mean, we should not only look, they suggest, to the impact of temporary work on employment probability, but also on probability to remain in temporary work or unemployed. In that case, you will find that temporary work may be conducive sometimes to temporary work trap. I already explained perhaps these other two arguments, that temporary work might not reduce the job-specific work experience gap, and also the fact that perhaps in the case of young people that experience long unemployment duration, we should rather provide active measures, proactive schemes, counseling, training programs, to help them find a job. And increasing flexibility, as I was arguing before, might be more effective for skilled people rather than for low-skilled people. So for these specific groups, we need to introduce some further intervention like proactive schemes and training, counseling, and so on. So we should distinguish within the youth unemployment group pool different groups according to their skill and implement different interventions for them. In fact, the interventionist view would suggest that we should not only introduce labor market flexibility, but also passive income support during unemployment spells and social security provisions for the temporary workers. One problem that we experience in Europe as a consequence of the introduction of temporary work is that we have problems for these people in getting a pension, and therefore there is a huge effort by policymakers in Southern Europe especially to introduce some kind of pension scheme for people that are into these temporary work traps. Also, there are proactive schemes to increase employability are also necessary to make flex security rather than flexibility, which is also the new keyword suggested by guidelines suggested by the OECD and other international organizations. I see. Very short time. And then I will just introduce my conclusion. My conclusion is that we should look, when we want to understand the reason of high or low youth disadvantage, especially the relative disadvantage of young people in the labor market, we should look not only at the labor market itself, but also at the educational system and also at the training system that we have in a country. So it is the complex of these factors that can explain the youth unemployment, the youth disadvantage. I will skip this classification and just say that, for instance, in Europe, we can find different systems according to the emphasis that countries put on each of these components of the school-to-work transition system. For instance, Germany and other countries close to Germany that follow their system put much emphasis on the duality principle. We were speaking about making vocational education more attractive. In Germany, they use apprenticeship during education, and this is quite successful. So they have, of course, some problems like early tracking, the difficulty to increase the overall level of education in recent years, and so on. But Germany also experiences a very low unemployment rate for young people. And also, it's the only country where the youth to adult unemployment rate, so the youth relative disadvantage, is equal to 1. We have the Scandinavian system where every young person is offered a proactive scheme before 6 months of their unemployment spell. So they are provided also active labor market policy. The Anglo-Saxon system, which is not only labor market flexibility, but also high quality of education, good counseling on how to find a job already by the educational institutions, which is typical in other countries of Europe, for instance. And instead, in the case of South Mediterranean system, we have a lack of other policies, but the intervention of the family to support the unemployed. And recently, we have introduced only some temporary work as an instrument to reduce the youth experience gap. And then we have also the case of youth of new member states, which perhaps experience similar characteristics, but I don't know whether they are a system themselves. When we compare the employment rate of young people, it's not my graph I took from another scholar, but it's interesting to notice that the labor market employment rate is very different according to the expenditure also on social protection as a percentage of GDP. And we can perhaps think of developing a classification of European system of school-to-work transition, which is very similar to the Esping-Andersen classification of welfare systems, according to the role of the state in the school-to-work transition system. Generally speaking, and this is my conclusion, we find that youth unemployment is lower not only where there is more labor market flexibility, but also where the educational system is more flexible and based on the duality principle. It provides work experience in addition to education, where labor market flexibility is coupled with high educational attainment, and where proactive schemes are fine-tuned to the needs of the weakest groups and are used as an instrument to help especially the weakest groups of young people, and households do not bear all the cost of youth unemployment. And in the case of Europe, the Lisbon strategy is trying to summarize these kind of suggestions, policy suggestions for European countries. And this is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. We'll now move on to the two discussants. The first is Koji Suzuki, who's a consultant involved in global human resource management with Watson Wyatt, and he is based in Tokyo, although Watson Wyatt works all over the world. So, Mr. Suzuki.
Thank you. I'm very. It was a very good speech, and basically, I work for employer perspective for corporate, and recently we face these young unemployed issues, especially after the financial crisis, world financial crisis. All the Japanese companies stopped hiring. But still, in order to keep, how to say, sound organization, which means each Japanese company think that the important thing is to keep each generation. For example, even though they have a very hard times, they try to recruit some younger talents in order to keep from the mid to long time perspective. However, from the last year, we facing on the world financial crisis, even big companies stop hiring new younger generations, and we've experienced same experience when we experienced the collapse of bubble economy at the time of year 1990. At that time, many Japanese companies stopped hiring the younger generations, and which leads a higher unemployment rate for younger generations. So even though they graduate from top-ranked university like Tokyo University, Kyoto University, they couldn't find their job in big companies. So what they do was they work as temporary workers or part-time workers. But once they become the part-time workers, they couldn't find regular employee job in big companies anymore. Once they start their career as a temporary worker, they cannot move. They cannot change themselves. They couldn't find any more jobs as a regular employees in big companies. So that was very so it became social issues. So after such kind of failure, in the Japanese society, Japanese company tried to recruit the talents. Recruit the younger talents, especially new graduates. But as I mentioned earlier, world financial crisis has, after the world financial crisis, even major Japanese companies do not have any financial budget to recruit new graduates with unskilled workers. So I think this is a very same situation, and also I would like to get some hints for Japanese society, because we are also facing the issue for higher unemployment rates for younger talents. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for our final discussant, Young-Sup Che is a research fellow at CRIVET, which, as many of you may know, stands for the Korea Research Institute for Vocational Education and Training. Mr. Che.
Thank you very much, Professor Katz. And also thanks a lot, Professor Pastore and Professor Be, for all of your valuable presentations. It is great honor for me to take a chance to give some comments for your such valuable, impressive presentations. Professor Pastore gave us some explanations about current issues about youth unemployment, especially in terms of the schools to work transition process or social models of schools to work transitions. And Professor Be presented the current demand and supply mismatch in Korea using detailed statistical data. I firmly believe that all their suggestions are really valuable and should be seriously taken into account. As a discussant, I just want to add one important point. I believe it is very important to the issue of skills mismatch. That is, I think that I'm afraid that we are probably missing a very important point with regard with the issue of skills mismatch. At least in Korea, that is the social aspects of the skills or skills mismatch. I think that in Korea, the issue of skills mismatch, it tends to be approached just within the so-called education and training policy perspective. But I think that the skill needs of a certain employer are not determined just by the technological demand. That is. Instead, I think that skill needs of certain industry or certain jobs seems to be heavily influenced by the social aspects, including the structures and customs of labor markets and traditions of job demarcations and features of industrial relations. For example, there are two kinds of production system of automobile industry. First one is so-called PODIS system, which is based on the principle of the separation of conception and execution, and detailed job segmentation and routinized tasks. Other one is Japanese so-called lean production or Toyotist production system, which requires voluntary cooperation between workplace workers and less strict job demarcation and less detailed job segmentation. I think that Professor Harry Katz already published several books about this issue. Under these two production systems, I think that the requirements for so-called social skills, like communication skills or teamworking skills, may have quite different meanings and importances. That is, on the PODIS system, communication skills of workplace workers may be less required than the lean production system. That is, on the PODIS system, workers are not asked to communicate with other workers, but just to conduct their narrowly defined and routinized job tasks. Such a situation is quite different on the Japanese lean production system, that almost every worker should closely communicate each other and cooperate to maintain the smooth operation of the production lines. In that case, communication skills and teamworking skills are very essential for securing the company's competitiveness. Of course, there exists specific institutional arrangements which support these systems and make it possible to reproduce themselves. We can call it institutional complementarity, following the neo-institutionalist theorist. For example, I think that one of the important conditions for Toyota production system is the cooperative company-level trade unions. In this regard, I think that social aspects or social dimension is very essential for the proper understanding of the features and changes of skill needs, as well as the technological aspects or technological dimension. In these days, many people say that the rapid technological progress or changes in these days has greatly reduced the number of workers doing just the routinized manual tasks and increased the demand for so-called knowledge-intensive workers. So we can say that there certainly exists increased demand for the social skills. But what I'm stressing is that despite of such general tendency of increasing demand for social skills, the exact paths of development of skill needs within certain society is influenced by its own specific social structures or historical endowments surrounding the demand and supply of skilled workers. So I think that we need more comprehensive theoretical frameworks incorporating, I think that at least the two aspects. One is technological and the other one is so-called social. These two, at least two aspects. Taking into account this point, we can also say that the education and training policy alone is not enough to address the skills mismatch and the solutions. So I think the solutions for skills mismatch should be sought in wider social contexts and include measures like the reorganization or reshaping of customs and structures of labor market and also industrial relations. I think that without such measures, let me say that the technological measures like the expansion of specified education and training programs for emerging skills cannot address the problem of skills mismatch. I think that I'm in line with Professor Pastore in the sense that stressing the importance of the social structures or institutional frameworks as a whole. In short, what I like to stress is that we need to take into account social aspects as well as the technological aspects of the skill mismatch issue. Through this, will be possible to find more realistic solutions for any skills mismatch problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now have time for some questions, so make your question clear and also clarify to whom your question is directed. I believe there are people with microphones, so there's a hand up over here.
My name is Won Lim. I'm from POSCO. So today's issue is to improve mismatches between the education and the industry. One of the big issues, maybe all the issues in Korea or all over the world, is going to be the education, especially in Korea. So these days, the creativity is quite important, and also the creativity in education. So when we say, look at our education system, so in case of, if you ask the industry, so they said, oh, we need the young people, but they don't have a talent, or they don't have any experts. Why do universities educate them as a talent or as a very skilled student? So then there's always a gap. So you said you are talking about the unemployment, but the unemployment is also important for the youngsters. Before that, the university should provide very talented students. So there are several aspects in order to solve this kind of problem. Socially, governmentally, all the aspects should be engaged in. But I would like to know, or we would like to get some recommendations how to improve this gap, maybe in terms of university, or in terms of government, or in terms of social function. So that is, I think, one of the big issues in this session, but I don't get any solutions.
So I think that's a question directed to anyone on the panel that would like to comment. Does anyone want to respond? Professor Bay, yeah, turn on the mic.
I did not study such a problem in my pay, but traditional concept of education is important, as you can point out. But reality is employment very important issues for students and the university also. So I only suggested such a measure can improve the employability of students and high tertiary education institutions. So I will accept your comments, and I will think about such a problems also. Thank you.
Anyone else? Professor Pastore?
Thank you for question. I would like to suggest that, of course, my presentation was aimed to be very general, to provide a frame of mind on these complicated issues, and also, of course, to just touch on the most important problems. One problem that I just did not go into detail was composition of skills. Nowadays, it's not only a problem of increasing the level and quantity of skill, but also the quality of skills and also the composition of skills. This is a major point, and I understand that the conclusion that I find in my paper, which is also policy implication, is that we should perhaps think of the educational system as a more flexible system, something that is changing according to the needs of the economy. So it should be part of the educational system also to study the evolution of demand for skills in the economy. It is becoming more and more important for households to understand what is direction to give to their children when deciding which kind of education they should choose. So it is, I think, very important to reduce the degree of over-education in the society, also the length, because over-education sometimes is not a big problem in the long run, because some studies show that over-education is one way for high-educated people to get into the job and then get a proper job for their skill level. So they start from a low-level job for their educational and their skill level, but then after a while, staying within the firm, after 4 or 5 years, there are studies, longitudinal studies, that show that this is a way to get to the proper job they deserve, or that is appropriate for their skills. But this is a kind of misallocation of resources for households, for firms, for the educational system that is producing skills that are not requested from the labor market. So my policy suggestion on this point, specific point, is that the educational system should start, and also the state sector should provide the studies of the evolution of demand in each country in terms of skills. I think this is an important policy suggestion for policymakers. And also generally, I gave some suggestions about the importance to target proactive schemes. I mean, perhaps the Scandinavian system, where we have a lot of state expenditure in proactive schemes, training, counseling, and so on, maybe not very effective unless we target. Also in that case, we should target the expenditure to specific groups. So I think that much needs to be done to improve the skill matching in the labor market and reduce the misallocation resources in this sector.
Mr. Suzuki?
Totally agree with your question, because I work closely with the top management of the company, and many top management claims about the level of fresh graduates recently. It's not only terms of expertise or engineering skills or business expertise, but fundamentally the way of thinking, innovative thinking, or creativeness, or much more fundamental thing is communication skills, facilitation skills, how to collaborate together with others, especially the younger generation. They played with computer games in their childhood. They don't play much. They don't have interaction with others. So the top management feel that most of the younger generation lack of communication or social skills. So that is very hard to recruit younger talents without any of these experience. So one of the solutions for, of course, we expect some improvement from universities. But some companies, my client companies, try to start interaction with university directly to communicate what kind of people we're looking for. And some university, some company start individual classroom in China, for example. Some Japanese companies started own classroom inside the Peking University, and tell what kind of skill they're requesting, and also we have to tell what kind of fundamental skills, competencies are required when you enter a company. So I think from company side we can do something to start interaction with university.
Thank you. Additional questions over here? The microphone's over to your left.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bernard Hugonnier, OECD. You've been concluding that one solution could be to develop, Mr. Pastore, could be to develop a sort of dual system for education. We have some second thoughts at the OECD concerning this for many reasons. First, we do recognize that there is a short-term benefit, that is the unemployment rate of the youth would be lower. But you have some drawback. The first one is that in the countries where you have such a system like Germany, Switzerland, and also Austria, the streaming is done at a very early age, at the age of 10, which is too early to advocate that you are really made for technical or professional education rather than for academic education. The second one is that most of the time the streaming is done according to social economic status, which is creating some social inequalities. The third is that if you look at the performance of those students taking technical or professional education in PISA, they are doing much lower performance. They have a much lower performance than the others. And third and fourth is because their flexibility in the longer run is much lower. That is, their capacity to change not only job but profession, because they have two specific skills, and therefore the capacity to change jobs or professions is very low. So we have some second thought, and we think that we should have a dual system, which is done at not too early age, something like 15 or 16, and not 10. Second, you should create some pathways between technical and professional education to academic education. And third, you should make sure that apart from the very specific skills to be acquired, you need to develop some generic skills, allowing those students to be much more flexible. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Pastore, did you want to comment briefly? There's another question, and I want to give them a chance, so just make a brief comment.
Thank you for your question. I think I totally agree with you. The dual system of Germany has also its own drawbacks, and one is early tracking, and so I think that every system should be seen in its context and also with its pros and cons. We should perhaps think of finding guidelines to catch the best of each system, and for instance, as far as I know, the Bologna process has tried to make some summary of the different qualities of the European educational systems. In Italy, we introduced some duality principle, but also at the university, that some courses should be, instead of having classes, some exams should be passed into a workplace, but only few of them, and only at the university level. So when the general education has been already acquired in the high school, and so on. I mean, and I totally agree. We should think also. I mean, should think carefully about the advantages and disadvantages of each system.
Okay, thank you. And we're running out of time, but if you'll make it short.
Yes, my name is Jürgen Wöhler from the German Korean Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I just want to make one distinction with the early separation, because that's perhaps mixed up. In Germany, we decide in the age of 10 if you stay in a basic school, which then doesn't qualify you for any university education. But the vocational aspect, that is decided only if you are 15 or 16, and the tendency is going that even people with a high school education would do vocational training, depending on the industry. So banking industry, more than 2/3 of the apprentices have a high school education, and then would go after 2 years apprenticeship to university and then be better qualified because they are practically experienced. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank the presenters, the discussants, and the audience. As is typical, the panelists will stick around for a bit, so if you have a question you didn't get a chance to ask, I'm sure they'd be happy to hear your views after the session concludes. Thank you very much.